Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Twilight of the neocons. With the averting of war with Syria at the last second and the opening of some kind of dialogue with Tehran, it would appear Washington's neocons and armchair generals are falling on hard times. Ever since the end of the Cold War, Washington has always been in need of an enemy. Talking to Iran certainly is one of their worst nightmares. So, is there a plan B? To crosstalk what's next for the neocon agenda, I'm joined by Grant Smith in Washington. He is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy. And in San Francisco, we cross to Bruce Fein. He is the founder and president of the National Commission on Intelligence and Foreign Wars. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Grant, if I can go to you first in Washington, let's go through the countries: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Israelis. The list can go on. But they're not picking up the phone too often when Washington's calling because no one's really listening anymore. Agree or disagree?
Oh, I don't know about that. I think, in your setup, you mentioned the neoconservative plan for Syria and the brick wall. But if you look at what's been going on ever since the first hardcore neoconservative doctrine for the region was laid down in the 1996 Clean Break Plan, you can kind of do a checklist for Syria. And what have we seen? We've seen the Syria Accountability Act of 2003, which severely limited U.S. diplomatic engagement with the country. We've seen that Syria has not been allowed to engage in any sort of negotiations over the Golan Heights. We've seen the recommendation by the neoconservatives to Netanyahu, but implemented by Bush, to continually have harassment and open attacks on the regime. We've seen the delegitimization of the country. So, there's been perhaps a setback, although the Clean Break and other neoconservative doctrine has never actually called for open U.S. conflict with Syria. If you look at Syria in particular, those points I mentioned, about 100% of the neocon ask has been met, and for all intents and purposes, moving toward chemical weapons disarmament and having the president already declared he's willing to attack is a win.
Well, okay, Grant, it's interesting. It's interesting what you say, because it makes it sound like success is defeat here. Bruce, you want to jump in? Go right ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think Grant misses the forest for the trees. The fact is, the American people, by overwhelming margins, like 4,000 to 1, and I spoke to maybe 24 members of Congress after the recess who had consulted their constituents on whether we ought to initiate war against Syria, whether for use of chemical weapons or otherwise. And it was that staggering opposition that caused the president to flinch and decide, no, he'd look for another alternative to avoid embarrassing defeat, which would have been overwhelming in the House of Representatives. Now, the reason why this is a turning point is that in no other situation since the Cold War ended has the Congress of the American people turned so decisively and vocally against this idea of empire. We intervene everywhere around the world because we have some obligation to save humanity from disaster, and that our national security interests are implicated no matter what happens, whether it's Burundi or Rwanda or Syria or otherwise. A staggering opposition. Up until that time, we were in Kosovo, we were in Bosnia, even the Iraq War, the phony weapons of mass destruction. The public opposition remained rather quiet and tepid, but here it was so overwhelming. The American people want the United States to defend its own interest here at home.
Well,
we don't go abroad in search of monsters.
But do you think anyone inside
Bruce,
is anyone in the Beltway going to listen?
Really
Go ahead.
Has the neoconservative plan for the region been at all thwarted? And I agree with you that there was a massive uprising, popular discontent with wars, but that wasn't the question. The question really was, has this driving force, which has been mysteriously transplanted now into the Obama administration with his declarations at the UN of American exceptionalism and every bit of baggage that carries, has a neoconservative design on the region been thwarted? My contention is, About 70% of that agenda has been completed, and kind of the leftover items are rebuilding, to some extent, Israel's economy away from socialism, and some minor points along the lines of the U.S.-Israel relationship, including lessening U.S. pressure over them. But my argument isn't that there wasn't massive backlash against another ill-advised intervention. My point is simply that there's no indication that there's been any defeat of the designs of the major foreign policy drivers in Washington. They may have had a setback by rather
I would disagree.
Imprudently jumping on Obama's
all right. Let's go to Bruce.
Congress.
Let's go to Bruce in San Francisco. Good point, Grant. Bruce in San Francisco. Go ahead.
No, but I think that's incorrect reading of the situation, Grant. Look at the neocons. If we view them as the voices of John McCain and Lindsey Graham, they wanted to attack Syria. They want almost immediately to threaten and to invade and attack Iran in the event that some national security surveillance says that they've got a nuclear weapon. They wanted us to be involved in the transition, however bad it was, from Mubarak to whoever was going to be ruling in Egypt. They want the United States to be there controlling the political destinies of all those countries, including those in the Persian Gulf. And in my judgment, that has clearly been defeated. We simply are not given the American public opinion and the turning away from the Congress of this military projection everywhere to be held morally and otherwise responsible for the fate of everything that moves, including the pressure that, the neocons wanted to go in Darfur in Sudan. And I think that's clearly out of the question given the sentiments today. It's true that if you look far enough back, there are neocons gains that you're identifying. But if you're projecting forward, I think this is the turning point. It is what Winston Churchill would call the beginning of the end.
Grant, would you?
Well, I would disagree with that. You're looking at one small victory in what's been a rise since pretty much the late 70s, 1980s of hardcore policy from this movement. If you look at a single victory that was snatched from the jaws of defeat and ignore that all of the policy apparatus, all of the political appointees who have been embedded into U.S. government, all of the fundraising to keep people like McCain and Lindsey Graham in power, none of that has gone away. And the moment that the U.S. public is distracted, there is not going to be another chance for an uprising. If Obama, in fact, had simply taken the decision, as no doubt many of his advisors had urged him to do, then it wouldn't have mattered. So I really think that the celebration is much, much, much too early.
Okay, Bruce? Go ahead, because I've never seen the American people play a big role when it comes to this neocon agenda, particularly in the Middle East. Only when Obama goes to Congress we actually have an opinion out there in the heartland. You can't extrapolate from one example.
Peter.
Go ahead, Bruce. Go ahead.
No, well, Grant, I walk right in front of the White House every day on the way to work, and I've never seen a sign out there saying we need more intervention in the Middle East, in Asia, the pivot toward Asia, or otherwise. Not a single sign, and they have a lot of bizarre signs out in front of the White House. And the fact is, this is the first time I say Syria is an example, the first time in decades where the American people vocally stood up and the president flinched and they said no by overwhelming majorities, over 4,000, 5,000 to 1. And this was uniform across every single congressional district. And we had members like Nancy Pelosi defending the president, even though her own district was like 99 to 1 against going to war. Now, I agree. That doesn't mean that trend is going to continue forever, because nothing is foreordained in history. But in terms of a landmark change in the sentiments of the American people and where the United States is going, that was huge, because it sends a message in the future to all other countries. Well, maybe the United States is not going to intervene in the future. We can do things, and we won't confront predator drones and other military intervention by the United States. And the United States needs to get back to defending its people.
Okay, let's get an example here.
And
let's
not
get an
going
example.
abroad and trying to remake the world.
Grant, if the United States is going... No, Grant, let me ask you a question. Grant, let me ask you a question. So, the United States, Obama, because of pressure from the Saudis, from the Israelis, they're going to attack Iran. Do you think he's going to ask the American people, oh, is this a good idea to attack Iran? No, that's never going to happen. The reason why he went to the American people on Syria, because he'd painted himself into a corner. You have to thank Mr. Putin for this, not the American people. Sorry.
Well, he did paint himself into a corner.
Well,
but,
I simply can't agree with that.
I disagree. Behind the president whenever there's been a triggering event, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin, whether it's Pearl Harbor, you know, all of the groups that are lobbying for non-intervention tend to disappear after a catalyzing event takes place. And the region at this point is just absolutely on a hair trigger for that sort of thing to happen. You know, if you really look skeptically, we have Russia, which announced to the UN in a report early this year that the rebels had used chemical weapons. And then we have more attacks. And then suddenly we have allegations probably provided by Israeli intelligence that no, it was the Syrian government. And to this day, I haven't seen any credible intelligence, anything other than assertions, giving a clear idea of who did that. Now, the next triggering event that just happens to fold neatly into the bigger goal of regime change in Iran is likely out there. The tripwire may already be set. We don't know. But Americans, unfortunately, are somewhat the weak link in this decision process. If you look back at history,
I disagree.
All right, gentlemen, we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Neocon agenda. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing what's next with the Neocons. Okay, go back to Bruce in San Francisco. We were talking about, Grant was talking about the American people, a possible attack on Iran, and public opinion. So, Bruce, go ahead, weigh in, agree, disagree.
I disagree with the idea that American public opinion rallies behind the president no matter what the war cause in the manner of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was quite different. There was ocular evidence. There clearly was an attack. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Grant mentions, that's based upon a phony, fraudulent claim of a second torpedo attack that history shows was known to the executive branch at the time the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed. And it was ultimately the American people, after told so many lies about Vietnam, forced the end of the war. Similarly, the American people experienced in Iraq, and other lies about weapons of mass destruction and suppression of truthful evidence. And so American people now are much more suspicious of non-Pearl Harbor type evidence that suggests that we have an urgent need to use military force to protect our interests. For example, President Obama was saying, well, the Syrians are likely to use chemical weapons against our soldiers someplace in the United States, you know, unless we make this red line retaliation against President Assad, which no American really believes that the Syrians are going to be using chemical weapons, you know, against the United States. And in the future, in my judgment, the American people have been so misled, so chronically about dangers, inflating them a millionfold and equating even Al-Qaeda to the equivalent of Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe and the Soviet Red Army and Hirohito's Zero pilots, that they become very skeptical, especially at a time when we have a very, very austere economic situation where we can't even afford, with a $17 trillion natural debt, to go abroad and try to save the world for every kind of evil that we discern.
Okay, Grant, stay with it.
Yeah, well, I wish,
go ahead, but I'd like to talk a little bit about Iran. Go ahead, Grant, go ahead.
Basically, the premise here is that there's a thawing in relations with Iran. And to me, the idea that the two presidents have exchanged letters doesn't represent a thawing of relations with Iran. What would represent a thawing? getting out from behind the skirts of the Swiss and actually having some sort of diplomatic representation in Tehran would be something real, perceptible